Excellent. So we are continuing our 1 Peter series. So if you've got a Bible, you can turn to 1 Peter chapter 3. I've just come up with a different... There we are. I seem to have two sermons on my screen. One was 1 Peter chapter 1. That was not helpful from a few weeks ago. So 1 Peter chapter 3. Verses 1 to 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. But this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good, and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. I don't know what emotions are going through you at the moment as you heard that passage read. There's probably a range of emotions in the room at the moment. There might be those who are feeling a bit angry because this just seems another example to you of how the Bible is out of date and out of touch with our culture and can't speak into today's context. I would ask you just to bear with me and as we go through the whole passage and see how these verses fit together. And actually, I think when we understand them properly, there is something beautiful about God's design for marriage that we see in these verses. Some of you may be feeling a bit upset because these sorts of passages on marriage, for whatever reason, trigger feelings of pain in you. And our culture often adds to that pain, especially if we're single, and this is something which causes pain for us, because our culture says that unless you are in a sexual relationship, you can't truly be fulfilled, which is a lie. And actually, teaching on marriage is crucial. Maybe you think, I should have skipped this week because I'm not married. You shouldn't have done, because teaching is marriage for all of us, whether we're married or not, because we all have a role in the church to play in supporting and encouraging and enabling good marriages, which is a key to how we function as a community and part of our witness to the wider world. Some of you may have become fearful as I was reading those words, because you've perhaps experienced abusive relationships, and words like I just read in your mind trigger that and make you think this is just encouraging that kind of relationship. I want to say categorically at the outset, we're going to hear more about that subject a little bit later, but categorically at the outset, that abusive relationships grieve the heart of God, that he is utterly opposed to them, and even this passage, when understood properly, comes against such relationships. And as a church, we want to walk together through all of life, even the painful bits, even the hard bits, even the passages in the Bible which for us just cause problems. We want to work together through them. And if this sermon does trigger things, negative emotions in you, then I encourage you, don't just push those down and hide them. That's probably God trying by his Spirit to bring something to the surface that needs to be spoken through, talked through, and prayed through. There'll be prayer minister at the end. There'll also be things I'll connect us with at the end where we can do that further. This is a series called Radical Holiness. If we could just go back to the beginning of the slides, they seem to be on the second to last slide currently. Called Radical Holiness, as hopefully the image will come on the screen now. And marriage is a holy thing. Marriage is something people shouldn't enter into lightly, should be taken seriously, and that should affect us if we are looking for someone to marry at the moment, or if we are currently in marriage. It should massively influence how we view such relationships. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to walk through this verse by verse, phrase by phrase, and see God's design and purpose in marriage. So verses 1 to 2 on the first slide, please, Tom. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the words, they may be won without a words by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Peter is instructing Christian wives here, and the context seems to assume that at least some of these wives have husbands who aren't yet believers in Jesus. And there is a way that the wife can behave towards the husband, which he says will influence your husband positively towards Jesus, without even saying a word. And this is a broader principle. It's not just here. It's not just in this context of unbelieving husbands, where we see this theme of wives submitting to the husbands in the New Testament. It also comes up in Ephesians 5, verse 22, Colossians 3, verse 18. So it's a general New Testament principle that Peter here is applying in this particular context. But we can also apply it, as the New Testament says, more broadly. And so I just want to ask a question. What does submission of a wife to a husband mean? And I should flag up, I've taught this sermon through with Claire before. This isn't just me imposing my views on the passage, and it's a journey through 10 years of marriage now we've been on together. Firstly, I could say all sorts of things, but we don't have enough time to say lots. So 3 things. Firstly, submission does not mean a wife is a doormat, or whatever phrase you want to use. I love the context of submission in these verses. What is the submission doing? It is influencing her husband. It is through it that she is going to have a powerful influence over her husband towards Jesus. This is not a weak woman. This is a strong woman that he is encouraging. We see that as the verses go on more and more. This is a strong woman who isn't weak. It's a distortion of biblical submission to say it's just about rolling over. It's just about agreeing with your husband on everything. She didn't agree with her husband on her religion. That was a good thing. And there are times it is good for wives strongly to disagree with their husbands. It's not just doing what you're told. This does not give husbands the license just to tell their wives what to do all the time. That is a complete distortion. Submission does not mean weakness. Tim Keller is an American pastor, and he wrote a book called The Meaning of Marriage. And in it, his wife, Kathy, tells a story. It was him and his wife wrote this book called The Meaning of Marriage. And in it, his wife, Kathy, tells this story from their early years of church planting in New York when he was working long hours and was neglecting his family. So she says she threw a godly tantrum. She writes this: I took the china, took it out onto our balcony, and when he came in, I was smashing them with a hammer. I had to do some dramatic things to get his attention to show he was breaking things. But she was doing it not in a way that was kind of trying to put him in his place or talking about him negatively to her friends. She was doing it in a way which was trying to enable him to become the husband that God was calling him to be. That is good, godly submission. It doesn't just mean rolling over. Wives, do not be afraid to have difficult conversations with your husbands, to point out the ways that they need to step up and be a more godly leader, a more godly husband in the spiritual life and the more general life of the church, of the family. But there's a way of doing that in a submissive way, which isn't coming over him and talking badly about him or to him, but encouraging him into that role God has given him. Secondly, submission is to the Lord. This passage starts, likewise, wives, be subject to your husbands. And I think that links us back to the very start of this kind of section, which Tom started last week about submission and authority in different relationships. And in chapter 2, verse 13, at the start, it says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Likewise, wives, be subject for the Lord's sake to your husbands. This is submission to Jesus. Ephesians 5:22 puts it much more explicitly, where it says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. This isn't a submission to your husband because he is worthy. It's a submission to your husband because Jesus is worthy, and this is how he calls marriage relationships to be. And he knows what he's doing because he created them. He knows what is good. It might come against the culture at times, but he knows what is good and godly and a blessing to both a husband and a wife in a marriage if it's lived out well. And he says, do this for the Lord. So even when your husbands do something wrong, which they will do regularly. I certainly do. You lean on Jesus. You trust Jesus because he is worthy, even when your husband isn't. You say, I trust you, Lord, to lead my husband and to lead the family. I'm laying myself before you, Jesus. Thirdly, submission is two-way. Just as a wife is called to submit to her husband, so the husband's God-ordained leadership role calls him to lay his life down for his wife, to come under her and to serve her and to lift her up, to submit his own desires and wants and needs to those of his wife. The Ephesians 5 passage where it says in verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. Just before that, the verse before, verse 21, says, in reverence for Christ, submit to one another. Submit to one another. And so the context of this submission thing isn't this kind of unequal relationship. It's a relationship of equality, but the way that sort of submission works is different. The wife submits to her husband's godly leadership. The husband submits by laying his life down and seeing his wife flourish. That's how it works. The two should come together. And as we get to verse 7 later on, we'll see very strongly that is what the husband's role looks like. Very practically, in big decisions in marriage, there ought to be a backwards and forwards between the husband and wife. There ought to be this kind of consensus building and sharpening and togetherness as you move forward together. It isn't one person saying, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, and the other person just timidly following along. The wife will try to respect the husband's leadership, and the husband will in turn try to please his wife. And if this is happening properly, and certainly from our experience, Claire can shout me down if this is wrong. That's a genuine statement. That means that there should be togetherness in most of your decisions as you move forwards. There might be times, it will be rare from our experience, where there just can't be a consensus, in which case at those times the wife says, okay, I will trust Jesus by allowing you to make the final call on this. But that should be rare, and it should be done humbly and with respect and graciously. Verses 3 to 4. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. Like Peter's just not holding back his ears. One sort of slightly controversial, awkward statement onto another. And this just categorically doesn't mean wives don't worry about what you wear or you can't wear jewelry. That's not what he's saying. You're completely missing the point. He's saying, look where your focus is. Look where your focus is. The focus, in fact, focus for all people, for all men and women, should be on the heart. It is the heart where God is cultivating something beautiful. God doesn't look at the external. He looks at the heart. And we need to know that. That is such a truth. I mean, as I was talking to Claire, she confirmed what I thought I already knew, that a lot of women find so much of their identity and value in external appearance. And the issue of self-worth and self-image is huge among women, particularly. So they're among men. I think it's even bigger probably for many women. And God says categorically here, I'm looking at your heart, my daughter, and I think you are beautiful. I see your heart and I love it. And that is where I'm cultivating beauty, not on the external. Put your eyes in the right place. Put your eyes where my eyes are. So important we grasp this, because this doesn't just affect marriage. You might be single here. It affects you just as much. It's all women, all people. Let's broaden it out. If you're a man here, look where God looks. He looks at your heart, and he loves a heart which is after him, which is seeking to be humble before him. How does Peter describe the way a wife's heart should look? It should be adorned with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. This doesn't mean you can't be an extrovert. It doesn't mean you can't be loud. Praise God for loud men and loud women. And for quiet men and quiet women. God has given you a personality. You don't have to have a personality change when you get married. Praise God. This is of the spirit, a gentle and quiet spirit. There is something about the inside which is humble, which is meek. It means not responding angrily in your heart when your husband does or says something wrong. It means not having that eye-rolling or sighing spirit towards him. As one Christian woman writes on her blog, she said this: it means speaking gently, forgiving quickly, and loving deeply. This is the kind of heart that is very precious, it says, in God's sight. They're stark words, very precious. That should make you sit up and listen. Wow, I want that. And it's I love my God. I want to have something in my heart which is so precious in his eyes. If you're a wife today, how are you cultivating that kind of heart? If you're a woman today, how are you cultivating that kind of heart? Because actually, this is what we should be all cultivating in our lives. And if you're a man as well, there is a humility this is speaking of, which is also true for you. But in a marriage relationship, God's saying this is something the wife particularly should be putting effort in. Maybe he knows it doesn't always come easy for women, and that's why he's saying put extra effort into this kind of heart towards your husband. Verses 5 and 6. But this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good, and do not fear anything that is frightening. So Peter here is pointing to the holy women of the Old Testament and saying, here are your role models, women. Don't look to the women of the day. The media says this person, and normally it's external things, something they've achieved, or it's a way they look, which says, look here. He's saying, no, look at the holy woman in the Old Testament. This is a picture of strength in womanhood. Look there for your role model. And notice where the source of strength comes. This is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves. It's because they hoped in God. It's because their hope was set in the right place that this kind of beauty and strength came. So where's your hope set? I just want to pause for a moment on this issue, because hope in life generally, but particularly in marriage, is a huge thing. Where your hope is set. The health of a marriage will depend to a good extent on where the hope of both the husband and a wife is set. If your hope is in your spouse to meet your needs and to fulfill you, you will have a life of disappointment. The marriage will be full of tension and difficulty. If your hope is in God, then it's a firm foundation for a marriage. Because the reality is your spouse is a sinner. Saved by God, a saint in the eyes of God, but still in the way they live, sin comes out day by day by day. It certainly comes out in me towards Claire. And putting your hope in a sinner never works. There is only one perfect spouse. His name is Jesus Christ. Putting your hope in Jesus means that you'll never be let down. It means that he'll never leave you or forsake you. Maybe some of you have come out of awful marriages. Put your hope in Jesus because he won't let you down. Maybe some of you are single and that is really hurting you, even as I'm speaking right now. Put your hope in Jesus because he will never let you down. He is beautiful. And even as men, we can say that he is beautiful, he alone is worthy, and he alone is a solid hope for your life. This is huge. So much of the problems in marriage come because we've made our spouse God, and we've put an unrealistic expectation on them that they can never meet. Don't do it. Don't do it. Time's too short to go into too much detail on these verses, but I do just want to flag up this difficult phrase in verse 6, which I'm sure grabs some of your attention. as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. That means you have to go around calling your husbands Lord. No. I mean, you're welcome to, if that works in your marriage. But I think it's a bit culturally strange in our context. But we still need to think what's being said here. Well, there's all sorts of stuff written on it, as there often is with things like this. But I believe that the reference is back to Genesis, particularly back to Genesis 18, verse 12. It's the only place where Sarah calls Abraham Lord. And it's as a term of respect, sort of. I mean, she's being a bit rude but respectful at the same time. She says, because my Lord is old. So maybe she's trying to tone it down a little bit by the fact he's saying when they couldn't have a baby still, but my Lord is old. And so it's kind of like my Lord, kind of like a respectful thing to call him in that context, rather than a bowing down in submission, oh, my Lord, every single morning. And I think we can take that today and say, what does it mean? It means talking about and to your husband in a respectful way. And I love, actually, the other point of Genesis, which Peter may well have in his mind as he chose this, and because remember, people he wrote to then often knew their Old Testaments incredibly well, particularly if they were Jewish, and so they would have known all around it. And actually, the only times we hear anyone obeying anyone in that relationship is Abraham obeying Sarah. There's two occasions, Genesis 16, verse 2, and Genesis 21, verse 12. And in the Genesis 21 example, I love it because God comes to Abraham and tells him to do what Sarah is telling him to do, what Sarah is telling him. I mean, it's a kind of, you can look at it, it's a sort of strange story because you think, well, it's not a great thing that she's telling him to do. But anyway, God tells Abraham to do what Sarah is saying. And I think there's probably, if any husbands are like me, which some of you might be, some husbands in the room, some men in the room, who sometimes, or maybe quite a lot, God is saying, do what your wife is telling you to do. We're like blocking our ears initially. Often takes Claire a few times and or someone else outside of our marriage to say something to me before I actually listen. That's not good. I'm just being honest. This verse, in other words, does not give husbands permission to have a right, my way or the highway attitude towards their wife. Part of our roles as husbands is to listen and respond positively to what our wives are saying. Claire often has far more wisdom, far more insight than I do. Do not spurn it. And so Peter directs our attention, the wide attention particularly, to the Old Testament women as models. But although he doesn't explicitly say it, I think we have an even greater model for this pure and this gentle and quiet spirit that he's talking about, and that is in the person of Jesus Christ. There's only one place where Jesus speaks about the quality of his heart. It's in Matthew 11, verse 29. And he says this, I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus Christ says, this is me. I am gentle and lowly in heart. I am the gentle and quiet one in spirit. The parallels are way too strong to be coincidental. This is who Jesus is. And so he's saying, look to me. Look to how I responded. Look, when I was on the cross, how I responded with forgiveness and mercy towards those who were sinning against me. One author who writes, I've just got to do a quick book review because it's the best book I believe that's ever been written, other than the Bible, a book called Gentle and Lowly, and all about this verse. And he writes this about what it means to be gentle in heart for Jesus. Jesus is not trigger happy, not harsh, reactionary, or easily exasperated. He is the most understanding person in the universe. The posture most natural to him is not a pointed finger, but open arms. What a beautiful description of womanhood. Beautiful description of Jesus, but when you see that, I think that's just encapsulates, I believe, what that verse is saying a wife should be like. Maybe you've heard all I've said so far, and still a big question remains. What if a marriage relationship turns abusive? You've talked about forgiving and and being gentle towards your husband particularly, but the other way around as well, a husband towards a wife. What if this relationship turns abusive? According to the crime survey for England and Wales, in the year ending March 2019, an estimated 7.5% of women and 3.8% of men, that's almost 2.5 million people in total, experienced domestic abuse in that last year. Staggering number. Clearly a huge topic and a massively sensitive topic, but one the church must not stay quiet about. And has incredibly courageously offered to come and share briefly now with us something of her story and some of the lessons that she's learned through it.
At this point in the sermon, we heard from someone who had experienced abuse within a marriage relationship, which we're not able to share on this more public stream. But I just want to share what she shared as she ended, where she said that shame is a lie. I was scared stiff of the response I might get when I revealed how awful my marriage really was, and yet instead I was overwhelmed with acceptance, love, and grace. And I want to say that at Redeemer, that is what we want to say. We want this to be a safe space as a church, and we weren't made to live with secrets. We weren't made to live in shame. And so if that is anything of your experience, then we would love to talk with you about it and to support you as you work through the situation.
I'm aware of the time. I'll just blame me to kids' workers. I don't really want to leave him before I finish the sermon. So if you can wait, if you've got stars to pick up before I finish, till I finish, in about 10 minutes, that'd be really helpful. Probably not helpful to only get one part of it, especially if you're a man. So yeah, there is something I think about men in particular. Obviously, abuse can be two ways, and not minimizing that, but there is something about men I think God knows, which means maybe it's something to do with the strength and like physical strength and things that they have a tendency to want to dominate women. And into that context, Peter writes verse 7, and he commands the complete opposite spirit of men towards women generally, but certainly in a marriage. The verse 7 come on the screen. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Or according to, not literally, it's in according to knowledge. Live with your wives according to knowledge. What's he saying? Well, firstly, likewise. He's just said likewise wives, now likewise husbands. So as to the Lord, there's something about being kind of, this is for Jesus. But also, I think, just following from what the wife said, this is like wives submit to husbands. Likewise, husbands have the same kind of submissive heart and attitude towards your wives. And this is how it plays out. Firstly, live with your wives according to knowledge. Knowledge of what? Again, he didn't say, but I believe, as I've read into it and looked into it, that really it's knowledge, obviously, of the gospel of Jesus and what the gospel of Jesus does. But I think it's particularly according to knowledge of your wives, hence the translation in an understanding way. Know your wives, husbands, and live with them according to the kind of person they are, to their desires, to their needs, to who they are. Know that. In other words, listen well and ask them how they are. Husbands, if you don't do that, start doing it immediately. I mean, literally immediately, as soon as you get home today and there's a spare minute. Two good questions to ask, which we've got a fairly busy day today, but I'll try and ask Claire today. If not, it'll be tomorrow. What are your current struggles and joys? And secondly, where am I letting you down as a husband? Second question might be hard to hear, but ask it. And wife respond in a loving way, a submissive way, but in a true way, an honest way. Because unless we understand each other and we communicate, that is going to be a big issue in marriage. Again, husbands, unless you really understand your wives, how can you live with them in a way which really loves them and raises them up? For most men, this sort of conversation doesn't come naturally. It's a generalization, but for a lot of men, this kind of conversation doesn't come naturally. That means you need to work at it and put effort into asking questions like that. As a husband, you'll often have power to shut down or to open up these kinds of conversations. And I want to urge you to open them up, to be proactive in asking these questions. For Claire and myself, we found that because our weeks are so busy, unless we diary this sort of conversation in, it won't happen properly. It might be a very quick thing. So for us, over the last couple of months, we made Wednesday evening, wherever possible, obviously sometimes diaries don't allow, a time when we sit down and we ask how our marriage is going, what's going on with one another, where the struggles are, sometimes talk about some of the issues with our children. We've actually got some time to do that. However it happens, husbands, there is a responsibility on you to make sure it happens. For us, it was definitely Claire initiating, but I could have easily shut that down. But I was saying, no, eventually, I can't remember how long it took me. But yeah, that is a good idea. We need to have this kind of conversation. Verse 7 continues, showing honor to the woman as a weak vessel, since they're heirs with you of the grace of life. Here we hit the final, slightly seemingly controversial statement. The woman as a weaker vessel. He says, seriously, how can you say that? Probably women reading this. They certainly are today. I actually think it's not too bad when you understand it. I think it's simply making a fact of biology, a physical fact, that on the whole, it's a generalization, but in most marriages, the wife will be physically weaker than the husband. Claire and I haven't had an arm wrestle, but I think that's the case in our marriage. And so you could use that, although Claire has now started kickboxing, so I better watch out. But you could use that kind of strength, physical strength, in two ways. You can use it to crush. I don't just mean physically crush. It's the fact that you are bigger and stronger and scarier, or maybe than your wife, and she finds that, means you can use it to crush her in your words or how you are, or you can use it to honor her. And he's saying, honor your wife, knowing this reality. Raise her up. I'm not much of a dancer, but if you go to the next slide, marriage is a bit like a dance. Quite often, quite a good analogy that's used. And we could pick all sorts of parts about how it's like a dance. But I think what I do know about dancing, I believe, is that if two people dance together, if you don't work together, and you don't communicate, then it's going to be a bit of a mess. And often there's maybe always, I don't know, but often there's a leader and a follower. And in marriage, a husband's role is to lead his wife in a way that she is raised up and she is honored, that she becomes who God has fully created her to be. And so husbands, in your marriage relationship, have this kind of picture of how you use your strength to honor your wife. And a key to that is to understand, as the verse said, that they are heirs with you of the grace of life. And in the inheritance that we have in Jesus is a theme throughout, started in 1 Peter 1, that we have this inheritance. Your wife, as a believer, if she's a believer in Jesus, has exactly the same inheritance as you do. In other words, she is a queen of heaven. She's an heiress of God, so treat her as such. How dare we as husbands treat our wives in a way which dishonors her and pushes her down when Jesus has paid such a great cost to raise her up and enable her to become the woman that he has called her to be. It should cut us to our heart. It cuts me to my heart the way I sometimes have done that to Claire, and it should cut us to our heart when we have sometimes spoken or acted towards our wives in a way which dishonors her. Ephesians 5, verses 25 to 27 says, husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. That's the model. That's the bar, husbands. I hope you understand that you fall far short. I certainly do. And we need to come daily or very regularly in repentance to Jesus and say, Lord, would you help me follow your example? And if the bar for our husband honoring his wife is high, then so is the consequence in the final slide if we don't do that. So that your prayers, one more slide, so that your prayers may not be hindered. There is this is a little mysterious phrase, but there is something about the way if a husband dishonors and treats his wife badly, it affects his relationship with God. That's what it's saying. You cannot expect to have this deep, intimate relationship with God if you are not honoring your wife. And we haven't had time to obviously do an in-depth marriage discussion this morning. I've still managed to overrun a few minutes, but if this has really touched a nerve with you, I would encourage you, please take it further. Don't just think, oh, that's really, talk to someone you trust, you know. Carol Tree, who is away for a couple of weeks now, but when she's back, has said she's more than willing to meet with anyone, a woman, but obviously with a man, if there's another man involved, I'm sure as well, or a couple together. Another point of reference I want to point you to is the Living Way counselling service in Sunderland, Christian counselling service, which from those I know who have used it, sure you won't mind me, Claire's used it, I think you might have said from the front, and it's been a real blessing to her, and I know it's a hugely beneficial service. So again, just search Living Way Sunderland, it will come up on Google, and make use of that. Claire and I are more than happy to meet with people. There'll be prayer ministry afterwards, of course, but to take it further, please do. I want to close by saying that there's something from this passage that shows that a real healthy marriage takes hard work, and it takes commitment. It takes, above all else, a refocusing on Jesus again and again and again. To hear these words from Tim Keller to close, we must say to ourselves something like this. Well, when Jesus let down from the cross, he didn't think, I'm giving myself to you because you're so attractive to me. No, he was in agony, and he looked down at us, denying him, abandoning him, and betraying him. And in the greatest act of love in history, he stayed. He said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they are doing. He loved us not because we are lovely to him, but to make us lovely. That is why I am going to love my spouse. Speak to your heart like that, and then fulfill the promises you made on your wedding day. The band could come up. I'll move forward a bit so you can not in your way. Father, I don't want to say too much really, other than Lord, help. Help me, help us in all of the different situations that we're finding ourselves in. Lord, all of the marriages or the singleness or the situations, the marriages we've come out of, Lord, all the context that we find ourselves in, Lord, it'll be different for all of us. But Lord, we ask, give us wisdom. Help us move forwards with you, Jesus. Help. We need you. This is an area we all need you, Lord. Thank you, Jesus, that you are our hope. Thank you that we are your children, Father God. And that is a solid rock. Amen.